August 7th, 1943, Guadalcanal. The jungle floor was thick with mud and the smell of rot. Major Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps moved through the abandoned American field hospital like a man wandering through a museum of the impossible. The Americans had evacuated 3 days earlier, retreating inland after a coordinated Japanese artillery barrage. They left behind what they could not carry. What Yamamoto found would haunt him until the day he surrendered. The tent still stood, canvas stained with mildew and blood. Inside, surgical tables gleamed under the filtered jungle light. Instrument trays lined the walls, each one labelled in English. Plasma bottles hung from metal racks, some still half full, but it was the records that stopped him cold. Patient logs meticulously documented in typescript, showing survival rates he could not reconcile with reality. Of 87 critically wounded soldiers treated at this station in July, 84 had survived. 97%. Yamamoto had been a military surgeon for 11 years. He had served in Manchuria, China, and now the South Pacific. In his experience, across every theatre, the mathematics of war medicine were brutal and unchanging. Soldiers with abdominal wounds died at rates exceeding 80%. Those with infected limbs faced amputation or death. The wounded who survived the first hour often perished within the week from shock, blood loss, or infection. These were the immutable laws of battlefield medicine. Until now. He picked up a surgical manual left on a makeshift desk. The pages were damp, edges curling, but the text was still legible. Treatment protocols for penetrating abdominal wounds. Whole blood transfusion within 30 minutes of injury. Immediate surgical intervention using mobile operating theatres. Post-operative penicillin administration every 3 hours for 5 days minimum. The language was clinical, matter of fact, as if saving 97% of the wounded was merely standard procedure. Yamamoto's own medical unit, positioned 15 kilometers to the south, operated under entirely different constraints. No whole blood, no penicillin in quantities beyond experimental samples, no mobile surgical capacity. His aid station consisted of 2 tents, 6 medics, and supplies that arrived sporadically if they arrived at all. In the past 3 months, his unit had treated 132 wounded soldiers. 104 had died, 80% mortality. The disparity was not a matter of skill. Yamamoto had trained at Tokyo Imperial University, studied under some of Japan's finest surgeons. His medics were disciplined, resourceful, capable of performing amputations with knives sterilized in boiling water when proper instruments were unavailable. But all the discipline in the world could not conjure antibiotics from empty supply crates. All the training could not replace blood that wasn't there. He walked deeper into the American hospital, his boots squelching in the mud. In one corner, he found wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. He pried one open with his bayonet. Inside, packed in straw, were dozens of small cardboard boxes labelled Penicillin G, 100,000 units. Each box contained 5 glass vials. He counted 23 boxes in the first crate alone. More than 1 million units of penicillin, just sitting here, abandoned because it was too heavy to carry in retreat. 1 million units would have saved every infected soldier in his division. Instead, it sat in an empty tent, slowly degrading in the tropical heat. Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest, not anger exactly, but a kind of hollow recognition. This was not a war between armies of equal capability choosing different strategies. This was a war between 2 entirely different conceptions of what a soldier's life was worth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Imperial Army medical doctrine of 1943 was built on principles that dated back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Endurance, discipline, and acceptance of suffering as a warrior virtue. The code of Bushido emphasized spiritual strength over material comfort. A soldier was expected to endure wounds without complaint, to accept death without fear. This philosophy extended to medical care itself. Japanese field hospitals were organized around triage systems that prioritized lightly wounded soldiers who could return to combat quickly. Critically wounded soldiers, those requiring extensive surgery or prolonged recovery, were given minimal care. The logic was coldly pragmatic. Resources were finite. Better to save 10 men who could fight again in a week than to expend all resources on one man who might never recover. The result was a medical system that functioned more as a filter than a hospital, separating the salvageable from the doomed. Yamamoto had internalized this doctrine during his training. He had performed hundreds of amputations without anesthesia because morphine was reserved for officers. He had watched soldiers die from infections that consumed their bodies over days, their screams echoing through the jungle, because antibiotics were not available. He had learned to see death not as failure but as inevitable consequence. War was suffering. Medicine could only ease the transition. But standing in this American field hospital, surrounded by equipment that seemed designed to deny death itself, he felt the foundation of his beliefs begin to shift. The Americans did not accept death as inevitable. They fought it with the same industrial ferocity they brought to their tanks and aircraft. They had transformed medicine from an art of triage into a science of mass survival. He found a logistics manifest dated July 20th, 1943. It detailed the weekly supply shipments to this single field hospital: whole blood, 15 units per day; plasma, 30 units per day; penicillin, 500,000 units per week. Anesthetics, morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, all in quantities that exceeded the total medical supplies available to his entire division. The manifest included a notation at the bottom: Priority Alpha. Critical medical supplies to be delivered ahead of ammunition if necessary. Yamamoto read that line 3 times, trying to comprehend the philosophy it represented. In the Japanese system, ammunition always took precedence. Soldiers were expected to fight until death. Medical care was secondary to combat capability. But the Americans had inverted the logic. They supplied medicine before bullets because they understood something fundamental. A wounded soldier who could be saved and returned to combat was worth more than a fresh soldier who would inevitably be wounded. The mathematics were elegant in their brutality. If you could save 97% of your wounded, you could sustain offensive operations indefinitely. Casualties ceased to be permanent losses and became temporary absences. An army that could resurrect its dead was effectively immortal. Japan could not compete with this arithmetic. Yamamoto moved to the surgical area. 2 operating tables stood side by side, each equipped with overhead lighting powered by a portable generator. He found the generator outside, a compact diesel unit capable of running for 12 hours on a single tank of fuel. His own medical station, operated by kerosene lamps, their smoke mixing with the screams of men undergoing surgery without adequate anesthesia. On the operating table, he found surgical instruments still laid out from the last procedure: scalpels, forceps, clamps, retractors, all made of stainless steel that showed no signs of rust, despite the humidity. He picked up a scalpel and tested the edge against his thumb, sharp enough to cut with minimal pressure. His own instruments, reused and resharpened countless times, were dull enough to require soaring motions during amputations. Beside the table, he found a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, and an anesthesia mask connected to a small tank of ether. The equipment was not remarkable in itself. Japanese military hospitals had similar tools, but the presence of these items in a field hospital, 15 kilometers from the front lines, was extraordinary. The Americans had brought the capacity for complex surgery to the battlefield itself. They did not wait for soldiers to be evacuated to rear hospitals. They operated immediately, saving lives that would have been lost in transport. Yamamoto opened a medical journal left on a supply shelf. The Journal of the American Medical Association, dated May 1943. He flipped through the pages, his English adequate enough to understand the technical language. Article after article documented new surgical techniques, new drugs, new protocols for trauma management. One article described a technique for repairing severed arteries using vascular clamps and silk sutures. Another discussed the use of whole blood transfusions in treating shock. A third detailed optimal dosing schedules for penicillin in preventing post-surgical infections. The journal represented a medical community in constant communication, sharing knowledge, refining techniques, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Japanese military medicine, by contrast, operated in isolated silos. Individual hospitals developed their own methods, but there was no systematic sharing of knowledge. Innovations remained local. Failures were repeated across units because there was no mechanism for collective learning. He found a photograph pinned to the tent wall. It showed a group of American medics standing in front of this same hospital tent, smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. They looked young, barely older than the soldiers they treated. But their uniforms were clean, their faces untroubled by the gauntness that marked every Japanese soldier on the island. They looked like men who believed they would survive the war. Yamamoto could not remember the last time he had seen that expression on a Japanese face. The rain began at dusk, hammering the canvas roof with a sound like distant machine gun fire. Yamamoto sat on an empty supply crate, surrounded by evidence of American industrial might, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught to believe. The Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual superiority. Bushido, the warrior code, was supposed to compensate for material disadvantages. One Japanese soldier, properly trained and spiritually prepared, was worth 10 Americans. This was not propaganda, it was doctrine, taught in every military academy, reinforced in every training manual. But spirit could not sterilize surgical instruments. Willpower could not synthesize penicillin. Discipline could not transfuse blood into a soldier dying of shock. The Americans had solved these problems not through superior warrior ethos, but through superior logistics. They had industrialized survival itself. Yamamoto thought of the soldiers in his care, lying in tents with dirt floors, their wounds wrapped in bandages that had been boiled and reused so many times the fabric was coming apart. He thought of the 19-year-old private who had died yesterday from a leg wound that became infected, screaming for his mother as sepsis consumed him. That soldier would have lived if Yamamoto had penicillin. The American manifest listed enough antibiotics to save 100 such soldiers. And this was just one field hospital among dozens scattered across the Pacific Theater. He pulled out his own medical log and began comparing numbers. In 3 months, his unit had received 2 shipments of medical supplies. Total quantity, 12 boxes of bandages, 3 bottles of iodine, 6 morphine syrettes, and 1 experimental batch of penicillin containing 20,000 units. Total. The American hospital manifest listed supplies for a single week that exceeded his quarterly allocation by a factor of 50. The mathematics of defeat became clear. Japan was not losing the war because its soldiers lacked courage. It was losing because its industrial base could not produce the material necessary to keep those soldiers alive. Every wounded soldier who died from preventable infection was not just a loss of manpower, it was a loss of training, experience, and morale. The cumulative effect was a slow bleeding of combat effectiveness that no amount of spiritual fortification could stanch. Outside, the rain intensified, turning the jungle into a roaring wall of sound. Yamamoto closed his medical log and stared at the American plasma bottles hanging from their racks, catching the last light of day. In the Japanese medical system, plasma was reserved for officers. Enlisted men received saline, if they received anything at all. The Americans gave plasma to every wounded soldier as a matter of routine. They had so much they could afford to abandon cases of it during a retreat. He thought about the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It emphasized self-sacrifice, endurance, and acceptance of death. Noble principles, certainly. But standing here, surrounded by equipment designed explicitly to prevent death, he wondered if nobility was just another word for making peace with inadequacy. The Americans did not accept death nobly. They fought it with every resource available, and they were winning. Major Yamamoto left the American field hospital as the sun disappeared behind the jungle canopy. He carried with him 3 vials of penicillin, 2 plasma bottles, and a copy of the American Medical Journal. He also carried something less, tangible, but far heavier. The knowledge that his soldiers were dying not because they were weak, but because their nation could not supply the tools necessary to save them. That night, in his own tent, he wrote a report to his commanding officer describing what he had found. He documented the supply quantities, the survival rates, the evidence of systematic industrial medical support. He ended the report with a single sentence: "We cannot win a war against an enemy who values the life of each soldier enough to supply him with the means to survive." The report was filed and forgotten. 3 months later, Yamamoto's medical unit was overrun during an American offensive. He survived and was taken prisoner. In the POW camp, he was treated by American medics who gave him penicillin for an infected wound. He recovered completely within a week. The irony was not lost on him. So if you still believe that wars are won purely through warrior spirit and tactical brilliance, comment the number 7 below. And if you think sometimes the real battle is fought not on the front lines, but in the supply depots and factory floors that determine who lives and who dies, hit like right now. Because what happens next reveals how 2 nations with radically different philosophies of medicine created a survival gap so vast it could be measured in the thousands of lives lost unnecessarily. By September 1943, the truth Major Yamamoto had discovered in that abandoned field hospital began rippling through the Japanese military medical corps. It arrived not as official doctrine, but as whispered realization. American prisoners of war with infected wounds recovered at rates that seemed medically impossible. Japanese soldiers with identical injuries died within days. The divergence was so consistent it could no longer be attributed to chance or individual variation. Something fundamental separated American battlefield medicine from Japanese practice. Colonel Kenji Ishikawa, Chief Medical Officer for the 17th Army, compiled the statistics in his headquarters on Bougainville. His report was clinical, devoid of emotion, but the numbers told a story more devastating than any battle loss. Japanese combat casualty outcomes, July through September 1943. Total wounded requiring medical intervention, 947 soldiers. Survival rate for abdominal wounds, 18%. Survival rate for infected limb wounds, 22%. Survival rate for chest wounds with complications, 12%. Overall survival rate for critically wounded soldiers, 20%. 80% mortality. The report included a comparison section based on interrogations of captured American medics and examination of captured American medical records. American combat casualty outcomes, July through September 1943. Total wounded requiring medical intervention, estimated 800 soldiers based on unit size. Survival rate for abdominal wounds, 89%. Survival rate for infected limb wounds, 94%. Survival rate for chest wounds with complications, 81%. Overall survival rate for critically wounded soldiers, 97%. 3% mortality. Colonel Ishikawa spent an hour staring at those numbers before adding his commentary. The statistical divergence cannot be explained by differences in wound severity or individual physician skill. Japanese medical officers are trained to international standards. The divergence must be attributed to material factors. Specifically, American medical units possess resources in quantities that exceed Japanese supply allocations by factors ranging from 20 to 100. Most critically, American forces have access to industrial quantities of whole blood, plasma, and penicillin. Japanese forces do not. He concluded the report with a section that would never be forwarded to Tokyo because it constituted an implicit criticism of Imperial policy. Our soldiers are dying at rates 4 times higher than American casualties, not because they lack courage or discipline, but because we cannot provide them with the medical resources necessary for survival. This is not a medical failure. It is an industrial one. The report circulated among senior medical officers, but went no further. To acknowledge the scale of the medical supply gap would require acknowledging the broader industrial inadequacy that gap represented. The Japanese military doctrine of the 1940s was built on the premise that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. To admit that premise was flawed would be to undermine the ideological foundation of the entire war effort. But for the doctors and medics working in field hospitals across the Pacific, the reality was impossible to ignore. They watched soldiers die from infections that were completely preventable with access to penicillin. They performed amputations that could have been avoided with timely whole blood transfusions. They triaged critically wounded soldiers to death because they lacked the resources to save everyone, forced to choose who would receive the minimal care available. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka ran a battalion aid station on New Guinea. He kept a private journal that he buried in a sealed container before his unit was destroyed in November 1943. The journal was recovered by Australian forces and later translated. One entry from October 5th read, "Today we received our monthly medical supply shipment, 6 boxes of bandages, 2 bottles of antiseptic, and 10 morphine syrettes for a battalion of 512 men. No penicillin, no plasma, no surgical instruments to replace the ones that broke last month. I am not a doctor anymore. I am a mortician with a stethoscope." The entry from October 12th was shorter. "Private Nakamura died this morning. Leg wound infected 3 days ago. With penicillin, he would have lived. I know this because I have seen American medical reports. They describe his exact condition. Their survival rate for similar cases is 94%. He was 19 years old. His last words were to tell his mother he tried to be brave. He was brave, but bravery does not cure gangrene." The psychological impact on Japanese medical personnel was profound. They had entered military service with the understanding that medicine was about saving lives, but the resource constraints forced them into a role that felt more like administering death with maximal efficiency. The triage systems that prioritized quick recovery patients over critically wounded soldiers created a moral burden that many medics could not reconcile with their training. Dr. Fumiko Hayashi served as one of the few female surgeons in the Imperial Army Medical Corps. Her unit operated a field hospital on Saipan. In her post-war testimony given to American military historians, she described the moment she fully understood the medical disparity. "We captured an American medic's kit in March 1944. Inside was more penicillin than our entire hospital had received in the previous year. There were also plasma bottles, morphine, sulfur drugs, surgical supplies, all packed into a canvas bag small enough for one man to carry. I realized then that a single American medic had more life-saving capability than our entire medical staff combined. Not because he was better trained, but because his nation had given him the tools to save lives and we had not been given those tools." The captured medical equipment became objects of intense study. Japanese doctors took apart American syringes to understand their manufacturing process. They analyzed the composition of American surgical dressings. They reverse-engineered American plasma bottles. But understanding how something was made did not provide the industrial capacity to manufacture it at scale. Japan's pharmaceutical industry in 1943 produced approximately 8 kilograms of penicillin annually. The United States produced enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier requiring antibiotics with surplus capacity for civilian use. The gap was not technological knowledge, it was industrial infrastructure. Japanese penicillin production faced multiple obstacles. Limited fermentation capacity. Penicillin required growing penicillium mold in large sterile tanks with precise temperature control. Japan had perhaps a dozen facilities capable of this process, most of them university laboratories operating at research scale rather than industrial production. Raw material shortages. The optimal growth medium for penicillin included corn steep liquor, a byproduct of American industrial corn processing. Japan's corn production was minimal, forcing researchers to experiment with alternative growth media that produced lower yields. Lack of coordination. Penicillin research was conducted by separate university labs, military research units, and private pharmaceutical companies, each protecting their findings as proprietary. There was no unified national program coordinating efforts toward mass production. Energy constraints. Industrial fermentation required consistent electrical power for temperature control and stirring mechanisms. By 1943, Japan's electrical grid was increasingly unreliable due to bombing campaigns and resource shortages. The result was a production system that could generate research quantities of penicillin but could not scale to military need. While American factories were producing billions of units annually, Japanese facilities struggled to produce millions. The ratio was approximately 1,000 to 1. Whole blood presented an even starker disparity. The American Red Cross had established a national blood donation program in 1941, collecting blood from civilians, processing it into whole blood and plasma, and shipping it to military hospitals worldwide. By 1943, the system was delivering 15,000 units of whole blood per month to the Pacific Theater alone. Blood was typed, stored in refrigerated containers, and transported via dedicated medical supply ships. The system treated blood as a strategic military resource, as important as ammunition or fuel. Japan had no equivalent infrastructure. Blood transfusions in Japanese military hospitals relied on direct soldier-to-soldier donations performed in the field. There was no collection system, no processing facilities, no cold storage, no typed blood banks. When a soldier needed blood, medics would test other soldiers for compatible types and perform direct transfusions using improvised equipment. The process was slow, dangerous, and severely limited by the number of available donors in any given location. The lack of stored blood meant that soldiers dying from shock due to blood loss could not be saved, unless a compatible donor happened to be nearby and healthy enough to give blood. In practice, most shock victims died waiting for transfusions that never came. The American system had eliminated this bottleneck entirely by treating blood as an industrial commodity that could be manufactured, stored, and distributed like any other military supply. Plasma represented another critical gap. Plasma, the liquid component of blood with red cells removed, could be stored longer than whole blood and did not require typing. It was ideal for treating shock in field conditions. The Americans had developed industrial processes for separating plasma from whole blood and freeze-drying it into powder that could be reconstituted with sterile water. A single plasma bottle could stabilize a shock victim long enough for surgical intervention. Japanese forces had virtually no access to processed plasma. Some units attempted to manufacture it locally by collecting blood, allowing it to settle, and drawing off the liquid plasma. But without refrigeration or sterile processing equipment, the results were inconsistent and often contaminated. Most Japanese medics simply accepted that shock victims would die and focused their limited resources on soldiers with survivable wounds. The cumulative effect of these supply gaps was a medical system that operated at perhaps 5% of American capability. Japanese medics were forced to perform battlefield medicine using techniques that the Americans had abandoned as obsolete. They amputated limbs that could have been saved with antibiotics. They watched soldiers die from shock because there was no plasma to stabilize them. They performed surgeries without adequate anesthesia because morphine was rationed for officers only. By late 1943, the psychological toll on Japanese medical personnel had become measurable. Instances of depression, anxiety, and moral injury were documented in unit reports. Some medics requested transfer to combat units, preferring the clarity of fighting to the ambiguity of selecting which soldiers would receive minimal care and which would be left to die. The triage decisions required by resource scarcity created ethical dilemmas that no amount of training could prepare doctors to handle. Captain Masato Fujiwara wrote in a letter to his wife that was intercepted and never delivered, "I became a doctor to save lives. But here I am forced to choose who lives and who dies, based not on medical need but on who can return to combat fastest. The Americans save everyone they can. We save only those we must. I do not know which system is more humane, but I know which one I would prefer if I were the wounded soldier." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The medical supply disparity was not simply a matter of industrial capacity, it reflected fundamentally different national philosophies regarding the value of individual soldiers' lives. American military doctrine treated casualties as temporary losses to be recovered through medical intervention. Japanese doctrine treated casualties as permanent losses to be replaced through recruitment. The American system invested heavily in medical infrastructure because it calculated that saving wounded soldiers was more cost-effective than training replacements. The Japanese system accepted high casualty rates as inevitable and focused resources on maintaining offensive capability rather than casualty care. These philosophical differences manifested in supply priority decisions. American military logistics allocated approximately 12% of cargo space to medical supplies. Japanese logistics allocated approximately 2%. American supply ships carried refrigerated containers specifically for blood and plasma. Japanese supply ships rarely carried medical cargo at all, prioritizing ammunition, fuel, and food. The allocation decisions were not random. They reflected calculated assessments of military effectiveness. American planners understood that an army that could recover 97% of its wounded could sustain prolonged offensive operations without replacement troops. Japanese planner accepted that wounded soldiers were effectively lost to combat and planned accordingly. The difference in survival rates, 97% American versus 20% Japanese, was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of these divergent value systems. The battlefield consequences became statistically measurable by early 1944. American divisions maintained combat strength at 85 to 90%, even after major engagements, because wounded soldiers returned to duty within weeks. Japanese divisions fell to 40 to 50% strength after comparable combat because wounded soldiers either died or remained incapacitated indefinitely. The Americans were effectively recycling their manpower. The Japanese were consuming theirs. On Tarawa, in November 1943, the Marines suffered approximately 3,000 casualties during the four-day battle. Within 3 months, 2,800 of those wounded Marines had returned to combat duty. Japanese forces on Tarawa suffered approximately 4,000 casualties. Fewer than 300 ever returned to combat. The survivors were either too debilitated by their injuries to fight or had died from infections during recovery. The pattern repeated across every engagement: Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. American casualty rates were often higher initially because American forces adopted aggressive offensive tactics. But within months, the majority of American wounded had recovered and returned to duty. Japanese wounded, by contrast, were effectively permanent losses. An American division could sustain 50% casualties and rebuild to full strength within 3 months. A Japanese division that sustained 50% casualties was combat ineffective permanently. The industrial medical gap created a force multiplication effect that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. American commanders could accept casualties that Japanese commanders could not because American casualties were temporary. This changed the fundamental mathematics of attrition warfare. In a traditional war of attrition, both sides lose soldiers permanently until one side runs out. But when one side can recover its wounded and the other cannot, attrition warfare becomes asymmetric. The side that can save its wounded effectively has an infinite manpower advantage. Major General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, understood this reality. In his final letters written in February 1945, he observed, "The Americans do not fear casualties because their casualties do not die. Their medical system returns wounded soldiers to combat faster than we can inflict casualties. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial system that manufactures survival." The medical supply gap also affected Japanese military morale in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Japanese soldiers knew that if they were wounded, their chances of survival were minimal. American soldiers knew that even catastrophic wounds were survivable with proper treatment. This knowledge influenced combat behavior. Japanese soldiers fought with the fatalism of men who understood that injury meant death. American soldiers fought with the confidence of men who believed they would survive to go home. The psychological impact extended to surrender decisions. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to fight to the death rather than surrender, but part of that indoctrination assumed that surrender meant torture and execution by enemy forces. When Japanese soldiers captured by American forces discovered they would receive the same medical treatment as American casualties, the ideological foundation of the no-surrender doctrine began to crack. POW interrogation reports from late 1944 documented increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers expressing surprise that American medics treated their wounds with penicillin and plasma. One captured Japanese soldier, a corporal from the 32nd Army, told his interrogators, "I was taught that Americans were barbarians who would torture prisoners. Instead, they gave me medicine that made my infected wound heal in 3 days. In our own hospital, that wound would have killed me. I do not understand this war anymore." By the spring of 1944, the medical disparity had become common knowledge among Japanese troops. Soldiers on Saipan watched American casualties being evacuated by helicopter to hospital ships offshore. They saw wounded Americans walking around days later, bandaged but mobile. Meanwhile, their own wounded lay in caves, slowly dying from infections, with no medical supplies available except morphine to ease the pain of death. The contrast created a cognitive dissonance that Japanese military propaganda could not resolve. Soldiers were told that spiritual strength made them superior to materialistic Americans, but spirit could not explain why American soldiers with bullet wounds were playing cards a week later, while Japanese soldiers with identical wounds were dead from gangrene. The propaganda about American weakness became increasingly hollow when set against the evidence of American medical superiority. Lieutenant Tadashi Kondo, a platoon leader on Guam, wrote in his diary in July 1944, "We are told to despise the enemy for their lack of bushido, but I have seen American wounded recover from injuries that would kill our best soldiers. They do not die because they have something we do not courage, not discipline, something else, something I do not have a word for. Perhaps it is simply the industrial capacity to refuse death." The diary was found on Kondo's body after he was killed in action. It was translated and filed in American intelligence archives, one of thousands of similar documents that recorded the slow realization among Japanese forces that they were fighting a war they could not win through courage alone. The specific mechanics of American medical superiority became clearer to Japanese observers as the war progressed. Captured American medical manuals were translated and studied extensively. What emerged was a picture of a medical system designed around speed, standardization, and resource abundance. The American military medical evacuation chain operated in stages, each optimized for specific functions. Stage 1. Battalion Aid Station. Located within 1 kilometer of front lines. Staffed by medics trained in immediate trauma response. Equipped with plasma, morphine, sulfur powder, and bandages. Primary function: stabilize casualties for evacuation. Average time from injury to aid station: 15 minutes. Stage 2. Mobile surgical hospital. Located 5 to 10 kilometers behind lines. Staffed by surgeons, anesthesiologists, and nurses. Equipped with portable operating theaters, whole blood, penicillin, and surgical instruments. Primary function: perform life-saving surgery. Average time from injury to surgery: 90 minutes. Stage 3. Evacuation. Hospital. Located on coast or at major supply depots. Staffed by full medical teams. Equipped with laboratory facilities, X-ray machines, and recovery wards. Primary function: post-surgical care and recovery. Average time from injury to evacuation hospital: 24 hours. Stage 4. Hospital ships or rear area hospitals. Located in secure areas far from combat. Staffed by specialist surgeons and rehabilitation teams. Primary function: long-term recovery and rehabilitation. Average time from injury to rear hospital: 72 hours. The system was designed so that every wounded soldier moved through the chain automatically. There was no triage decision about who received care and who did not. Everyone received full treatment. The only variable was how quickly they moved through the system. The design assumed unlimited medical resources and prioritized saving every life possible. Japanese medical evacuation operated entirely differently. Stage 1, Company Aid Station, located with frontline units, staffed by 1 or 2 medics with minimal training, equipped with bandages and iodine if supplies were available. Primary function: separate walking wounded from critically wounded. Average time from injury to aid station: 30 minutes to several hours depending on tactical situation. Stage 2, Battalion Field Hospital. Located 10 to 20 kilometers behind lines if such a hospital existed, staffed by 1 or 2 doctors with limited supplies, equipped with whatever medical materials had been supplied in the most recent shipment. Primary function: triage critically wounded into salvageable and non-salvageable categories. Perform amputations and minimal surgery on salvageable cases. Average time from injury to field hospital: several hours to days. Stage 3, Division Hospital or evacuation to Japan. Located far behind lines or in Japan itself. Equipped with proper surgical facilities. Primary function: treat soldiers whose wounds were stable enough to survive long transport. Average time from injury to division hospital: days to weeks. The Japanese system had no equivalent to the American Mobile Surgical Hospital. Critically wounded soldiers could not receive surgery within 90 minutes of injury. They either stabilized on their own or died during transport. The system was designed around resource scarcity and assumed that most critically wounded soldiers would die regardless of intervention. The triage decisions reflected this assumption. The time differential alone explained much of the survival rate gap. American soldiers received surgery within 90 minutes. Japanese soldiers, if they received surgery at all, waited days. In battlefield trauma, hours matter. A soldier bleeding internally has perhaps 4 hours before hemorrhagic shock becomes irreversible. A soldier with a penetrating abdominal wound has perhaps 6 hours before peritonitis becomes fatal. American medical response times were designed to beat these biological deadlines. Japanese response times were not. The supply differential compounded the time problem. Even when Japanese soldiers reached a field hospital quickly, the hospital often lacked the materials necessary for effective treatment. A captured Japanese medical officer, Captain Yoshiro Nakamura, explained this in his POW interrogation. We had surgeons who were trained at the same universities as American surgeons. We understood the same surgical techniques, but we could not perform those techniques without the proper supplies. You cannot perform a blood transfusion without blood. You cannot prevent infection without antibiotics. Time and skill mean nothing if you lack materials. Nakamura had been captured on Okinawa in April 1945. He described watching American casualties being treated at a nearby field hospital after his capture. I saw medics giving whole blood transfusions to soldiers who were unconscious from shock. They had so much blood they were transfusing everyone as a precaution, even soldiers who might have stabilized without it. In my hospital, we had no stored blood at all. We relied on direct soldier-to-soldier transfusions, which meant we could only help soldiers who had compatible donors immediately available. Most shock victims died while we searched for donors, he continued. The Americans were also using penicillin on every wounded soldier, even those with minor wounds, to prevent infection. We used penicillin only on officers with life-threatening infections, and even then, we often did not have enough to complete a full treatment course. I watched American medics discard partially used penicillin vials because the soldier had recovered and no longer needed the medication. We would have saved those vials and used them on multiple patients, but the Americans had so much they could afford to waste it. The abundance versus scarcity mindset shaped every aspect of medical care. American medics were trained to use resources liberally because supplies were effectively unlimited. Japanese medics were trained to ration everything because supplies were scarce. The result was American medicine that erred on the side of overtreatment and Japanese medicine that erred on the side of undertreatment. In battlefield conditions, overtreatment saved lives. Undertreatment resulted in preventable deaths. The statistical outcomes were documented extensively in post-war medical studies. A 1947 study by the U.S. Army Medical Department compared American and Japanese casualty outcomes across multiple Pacific engagements. The study found that for comparable wound types, American survival rates exceeded Japanese survival rates by factors ranging from 3 to 1 for minor wounds to 20 to 1 for critical wounds. The study attributed the gap to 3 primary factors: shorter evacuation times, average 90 minutes American versus several hours to days Japanese; greater availability of whole blood and plasma, effectively unlimited American supply versus virtually zero Japanese supply; universal antibiotic availability, every American casualty received penicillin versus less than 5% of Japanese casualties received penicillin. The study concluded, the survival rate differential between American and Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater represents the single largest medical outcome gap in modern military history. The gap is attributable almost entirely to logistics and industrial capacity rather than medical knowledge or physician skill. On Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, the medical disparity reached its most extreme manifestation. The battle lasted 36 days and resulted in approximately 26,000 American casualties and 21,000 Japanese casualties. The Americans evacuated wounded soldiers continuously throughout the battle. Hospital ships stationed offshore received casualties directly from the beach. Mobile surgical hospitals operated in underground bunkers close to the front lines. Every wounded Marine had access to immediate medical care. The Japanese, dug into extensive tunnel systems, had virtually no medical evacuation capability. Wounded soldiers remained in the tunnels, treated by medics with almost no supplies. As American forces advanced, they discovered tunnel complexes filled with Japanese wounded, many of whom had been dying slowly from infected wounds for weeks. American medics attempted to treat these wounded Japanese soldiers, but many were too far gone to save. A Marine Corps medic, Corpsman John Bradley, later described the scene. We found a room in one of the tunnels that was just filled with wounded Japanese soldiers, maybe 30 or 40 men. They were all in various stages of dying from infected wounds. The smell was unbelievable. We tried to help them, gave them penicillin and plasma, but most of them died anyway. They'd been lying there for weeks without any real medical care. If they'd been American casualties, probably 90% of them would have survived. As it was, maybe 5% made it. That's when I really understood what this war was about. It wasn't about who was tougher or braver. It was about who could keep their soldiers alive. The surviving Japanese medical officers from Iwo Jima provided detailed testimony about the conditions in the tunnel hospitals. Major Tsunezo Wachi described operating on soldiers using instruments sterilized in salt water because there was no alcohol or boiling water available. He performed amputations with soldiers biting on leather straps because there was no anesthesia. He watched men die from infections that he knew were preventable but lacked any means to prevent. The Americans would fire artillery at our positions all day, Wachi recalled. At night, we would hear their wounded being evacuated by helicopter. The helicopters made a distinctive sound. We knew that sound meant American wounded were being taken to hospital ships where they would receive surgery and antibiotics. Our wounded just lay in the tunnels, waiting to die. Some of them asked me to give them grenades so they could kill themselves rather than die slowly from infection. That was the only mercy I could offer them. The Okinawa campaign in April through June 1945 produced similar patterns. American casualties were evacuated by air and sea within hours of being wounded. Japanese casualties, many of them Okinawan conscripts, received minimal care, or none at all. The civilian population of Okinawa, caught between the two armies, observed the stark difference. Post-war interviews with Okinawan survivors documented their observations. One Okinawan civilian, Masahide Ota, recalled, "The Japanese soldiers told us that Americans were devils who would torture and kill us if they captured us. But when the Americans arrived, they set up medical stations and treated wounded civilians. They gave us food and medicine. The Japanese soldiers had told us to kill ourselves rather than surrender. But when we saw how the Americans treated their own wounded and how they treated our wounded, we realized we had been lied to. The Americans had something the Japanese army did not. They had the resources to care for people, not just to send them to die. By the summer of 1945, Japanese military medical personnel understood completely the scale of the disparity they faced. The arrival of the atomic bomb and subsequent Japanese surrender came before this knowledge could be systematically documented and transmitted through official channels. But in the personal writings, diaries, and post-war testimonies of Japanese doctors and medics, a consistent theme emerged. They had been asked to practice medicine without the tools necessary to save lives, and they had watched thousands of soldiers die preventable deaths as a result. Dr. Fumiko Hayashi, in her post-war testimony, summarized the experience. I was trained as a surgeon. I understood anatomy, physiology, pathology. I could diagnose infections accurately. I could plan surgical interventions that would save lives. But I could not perform those interventions because I did not have the antibiotics, the blood, the plasma, the instruments, or the time. American doctors with the same training could save 97% of their wounded. I could save 20%. The difference was not in our knowledge. It was in what our nations chose to provide us. The medical records recovered from Japanese military hospitals after the war painted a statistical picture of systematic failure. One field hospital on Luzon treated 812 wounded soldiers between January and April 1945. 649 died, 80% mortality. The causes of death were documented in the hospital log. Hemorrhagic shock, 212 deaths, could have been prevented with whole blood transfusions. Wound infection and sepsis, 374 deaths, could have been prevented with penicillin. Surgical complications, 63 deaths, could have been prevented with better equipment and sterile conditions. The log keeper, a medical orderly named Takeshi Yamamoto, added a note at the end. This is not a hospital. It is a place where we watch soldiers die while knowing exactly how to save them, but lacking the means to do so. When Japanese forces surrendered in August 1945, American occupation forces took control of Japanese military hospitals. American medical officers were shocked by the conditions they found. Hospitals with dirt floors, surgical instruments rusted from reuse without proper sterilization, bandages that had been boiled and reused so many times they were falling apart, wounded soldiers lying in rows, many with infected wounds that could have been easily treated with penicillin. American medics immediately began treating the Japanese wounded with American medical supplies. The results were dramatic. Soldiers who had been dying from infections recovered within days. Wounds that had been festering for weeks closed and healed. Japanese medical personnel watched in amazement as American antibiotics reversed infections they had considered fatal. One Japanese nurse, Haruko Tanaka, later recalled, "When the Americans arrived with their medical supplies, it was like watching miracles. Soldiers who we had expected to die were walking around a week later. The Americans were generous with their medicine. They treated our soldiers the same way they treated their own." That was when many of us realized that the war had not been lost because we lacked courage. It had been lost because we lacked medicine. The legacy of the medical disparity between American and Japanese forces in World War II extended far beyond the immediate combat outcomes. It represented a fundamental demonstration of how industrial capacity translates into military effectiveness in ways that traditional measures of combat power cannot capture. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery were visible weapons that could be counted and compared. Medical supplies were invisible weapons whose effects only became apparent when measured in survival rates. In the decades following the war, military medical doctrine worldwide shifted toward the American model. The principle that wounded soldiers were recoverable assets, rather than permanent losses, became standard across modern militaries. The concept of the golden hour, the critical first hour after injury when medical intervention has maximum effect, became central to trauma medicine, both military and civilian. The mass production of antibiotics, pioneered during World War II for military use, became the foundation of modern pharmaceutical industry. Penicillin transitioned from a rare laboratory curiosity to a commodity so common that it revolutionized civilian medicine. The American investment in medical logistics, the cold chain infrastructure for blood and plasma, the rapid evacuation protocols, all became templates for modern emergency medical systems. But the human cost of the learning process fell disproportionately on Japanese soldiers who died from preventable causes, while their nation's industrial system proved incapable of producing the materials necessary to save them. The 80% mortality rate among critically wounded Japanese soldiers represented approximately 150,000 preventable deaths, soldiers who would have survived with access to the medical resources available to American forces. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, who had discovered the American field hospital on Guadalcanal in August 1943, survived the war. He was captured on Okinawa and spent 2 years in an American POW camp. During his captivity, he had access to American medical journals and began studying the industrial processes that had created the medical supply advantage he had witnessed. In 1948, he returned to Japan and spent the remainder of his career working to modernize Japanese medical education and pharmaceutical production. He never published the report he had written in 1943 describing what he had found in that abandoned field hospital, but he kept it, and in 1973, he donated it along with his other wartime papers to the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. The report was translated into English in 1985 as part of a comparative study of World War II military medicine. It contained one passage that captured the fundamental truth Yamamoto had discovered that day in the jungle. I realized in that moment that the war was not being fought between soldiers but between industrial systems. We were soldiers with Bushido. They were soldiers with penicillin. Bushido could not treat gangrene. Spirit could not transfuse blood. Courage could not suture arteries. We were brave. They were alive. In the end, that was all that mattered. The abandoned American field hospital on Guadalcanal was eventually destroyed, first by Japanese artillery as fighting continued on the island, then by jungle growth that reclaimed the site. Nothing visible remains today. But the principle that hospital represented, that every soldier's life was worth the industrial effort necessary to save it, became the foundation of modern military medicine. The Japanese Military Medical Corps, rebuilt after the war under American guidance, adopted the American model completely. Modern Japanese self-defense force medical units train on the principle of maximum intervention for every casualty. They stockpile antibiotics, maintain cold chain logistics for blood products, and operate mobile surgical hospitals designed to reach wounded soldiers within the golden hour. The transformation was complete. The medical philosophy that had once been considered wastefully extravagant, treating every soldier as if his life had infinite value, became the standard. The triage system that had once been considered efficiently pragmatic, accepting that some soldiers must die so that resources could be concentrated on others, became obsolete. In the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, there is a small exhibit on battlefield medicine. It displays an American medic's kit from 1944, including plasma bottles, penicillin vials, and surgical instruments. Next to it is a postulated Japanese medic's kit from the same period, containing bandages, iodine, and a single morphine syringe. The label beneath the exhibit reads simply, "American medics carried these supplies. Japanese medics did not." This difference saved approximately 150,000 American lives during the Pacific War. The numbers are accurate. The explanation is accurate. But the deeper truth is more complex and more devastating. Those 150,000 American soldiers who survived would have been joined by perhaps an equal number of Japanese soldiers if Japan had possessed the industrial capacity to produce the same medical supplies. The war's outcome would not have changed. Japan's industrial base could not match American production in any category, medical or otherwise. But the human cost might have been different. The soldiers who died from infected wounds on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, on 1,000 unnamed Pacific islands, did not die because they were less brave or less skilled than their American counterparts. They died because their nation could not provide them with the industrial products necessary for survival. Courage was abundant. Penicillin was not. And in the final analysis, that was what determined who lived and who died. So if you believe that history remembers the wrong victories, comment 7 below. Because sometimes the real triumph is not in winning battles but in refusing to accept that wounded soldiers must die. The Americans did not win the Pacific War because they fought better. They won because they had built a system where fighting was only half the battle and saving lives was the other half. And in that invisible war between industrial medicine and traditional triage, between abundance and scarcity, between the idea that every soldier mattered and the idea that only some could be saved, the outcome was never in doubt. The rubber glove that became a blood bag, the mass-produced penicillin that reversed gangrene, the hospital ships that turned the ocean into an evacuation route. These were the weapons that won the war in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could match, not because they killed more efficiently, but because they saved more completely. Major Takeshi Yamamoto understood this on August 7, 1943, standing in an abandoned field hospital, holding a vial of penicillin in his hand. He understood that he was holding evidence of a kind of power his nation did not possess, the power not to fight harder but to refuse death itself, the power that comes from believing every soldier's life has value worth defending with every resource available. That belief, more than any weapon, more than any tactic, more than any strategy, determined who would win and who would lose. Not because it made soldiers more willing to die, but because it made them more able to live. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.